Thank you very much, Eric. My name is Jerry Brito. I'm the Executive Director of Coin Center, which is a public policy research and advocacy center that's focused on the public policy issues surrounding cryptocurrencies. And we have a great panel with us today. We've got two folks who are presently in government, making some policy around cryptocurrencies, and two folks who used to be in government. And so we'll start. Folks who are presently in government, we have Jennifer Shasky-Calvery, who is Director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and Commissioner Mark Wetjen, who is at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And these are two persons in government who have shown a lot of leadership around cryptocurrency, learning about the technology and developing rules to bring clarity to the space. And we also have with us Arthur Levitt, who's a former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and James Newsome, who's a former chairman of the CFTC. And both of them are presently advising Bitcoin companies. So I thought we'd do something a little different and maybe begin with the polling question, which is a little provocative, and get a sense of where folks are in a room as we begin to think about the regulatory space.
The next 5 years, what are the most developed nation governments most likely to do about virtual currencies? And just wait for it. Give me 1 second. Sorry, guys.
All right. Well, while we're getting that, why don't we get started anyhow? So maybe we can start by asking the folks who are out of government and now advising Bitcoin companies. You're advising these companies. What are the major regulatory challenges that these companies are facing? So why don't we start maybe with Mr. Levitt?
I think that lack of public knowledge of what the companies are and reputational issues. It's one of those industries that got the greatest publicity in terms of a negative event. And you combine that with the fact that I don't think more than a very infinitesimal percentage of people in financial services could define for you what a Bitcoin is or what it does. So if you have lack of understanding and you have reputational issues, Mt. Gox, any of those scandals, you've got a real problem. And the problem, the challenge for the industry is to do a better job of defining what the industry does, defining where we will be 10 years from now, which is hard for the average citizen to contemplate, but it's that definition which will turn around public opinion. I think even the nomenclature is against you. A Bitcoin sounds diminutive. Cryptocurrency sounds mysterious. I think that there's a big job to be done in terms of imagery, in terms of making this mainline. I think a lot of people in the industry think that mainline is something bad. It isn't. Mainline is essentially where it's going to be at if it's a viable industry. So I think there are obvious ways you can do it. And I think one way is to recognize that regulation isn't in and of itself an evil word. Regulation can be, and usually is, a stamp of acceptance, a stamp of approval, a stamp of having arrived. Now, I've been the object of punitive regulation for most of my working life. I haven't always worn the mantle of a regulator. I've been the regulated. So I know what that means. But to be totally anti-regulation is not a stamp that you want to embrace as well. I think sensible and balanced regulation is a stamp of approval for this and any other industry involving currency of any kind, shape, form, or name.
Mr. Newsome?
Yes, I would tend to agree with what Chairman Levitt just said. I think it's probably easy for most in this room to overestimate the government knowledge level of Bitcoin or virtual currency. I've been in a lot of the meetings with multiple agencies, and the level of understanding is low. And I think the quicker you recognize that and the quicker you start the discussions on a level with the regulators that they can understand, I think that is to your benefit. I think when you talk to most in Washington, they can do a better job of telling you what Bitcoin is not versus what Bitcoin is. Now, that doesn't necessarily stop the regulatory process. For years and years and years in the futures industry, a futures contract was not defined. And it really became defined more about the case law of what a futures contract was not versus what it is, particularly as defined by Congress. I think Chairman Levitt's comments are exactly right, that good regulation, I think, could be very helpful to the virtual currency industry. I think having regulated, transparent contracts of which the public understands, the public can support, would be extremely beneficial to the growth and acceptance of virtual currency as a mainstream currency.
So maybe a question for the regulators. You know, something that was brought up in the last panel is that one of the main benefits of Bitcoin is that it is an open network. It's an open protocol, and anybody can build on top of it. Now, regulators tend to regulate closed-loop systems, and so that's what they're used to. How do you approach regulating this network where the fact that it's open and anybody can come is one of the central pieces? Maybe we'll start with Ms. Calvery.
Sure. So our regulation in many ways is about transparency. So FinCEN at the U.S. Department of the Treasury focuses on regulation from the standpoint of preventing money laundering and the financing of terrorism. And so we're in the business of tracing the money. And to trace money and understand who is sending money or value to another, we need to have transparency in the system and know identities of individuals. So on the one hand, having an open system can be very helpful. However, the fact that it's pseudonymous and we can't necessarily get to the true identity is also a challenge. And so thus far, we have not treated virtual currency any different than we've treated regular currency or any part of the industry that we regulate. One part of regulating any industry is to make sure that you have an even playing field across all the different products and services and members of the industry. And so our approach has been to treat virtual currency as a money services business like any other traditional money services business, whether that be a money transmitter like a Western Union or a currency exchange, that it plays by the same rules and is required to follow the same regulations. The challenge for us going forward, and I was just mentioning to one of the previous panelists, it seems like both an opportunity and a challenge, is that Bitcoin is so different. The ledger is so different. The technology is so different. And it provides some real opportunities to rethink what information should we collect that might be important to tracing the illicit proceeds of criminals and combating terrorist finance. The challenge is that we have the existing regulatory regime. And so while we imagine a future one, we still need to abide by the current one. And it's that bridge from where we are now to where we should be in the future that seems to me to be the biggest challenge.
Commissioner Wetjen?
Yeah, I would echo some of those remarks. Because it's Bitcoin doesn't mean that we've really had to make all that many adjustments by way of policy adjustments per se, but looking at our rule set and understanding how Bitcoin fits into it has required some new and novel type of thinking. And I would say that the area that's probably most unique for us is, you know, if you have, well, there are two issues. One set of issues relates to the underlying currency or the spot or cash market for a commodity. That's one thing. And the other part of our jurisdiction is regulated exchanges that list regulated contracts for trading. On the second set of issues, the more regulated ecosystem in the derivative space, Bitcoin creates a number of new, interesting challenges for us. And I would say probably the single biggest issue there is along the lines of surveillance. Because every exchange that lists contracts has a whole host of surveillance obligations they have to abide by when regulating their own marketplace. And so you have to understand the technology of Bitcoin to understand how an exchange or a swap execution facility in CFTC parlance, you have to understand the technology, understand how those kinds of exchanges or platforms are going to be able to abide by their regulatory obligations. So it hasn't really, up until now anyway, required us to rethink the policies themselves. It's just more of an issue around interpretation and understanding.
So, sort of following up on that, with the recent LIBOR and FX rate sort of scandals, is there any evidence or worry at the CFTC that the spot market for Bitcoin might be being manipulated or could be manipulated, and do you have the authority to intervene there?
Well, I believe we do have the authority. It has not been tested, as you and I'm sure the audience knows. But I do believe we have the authority, and I believe we have the authority because Bitcoin, by I think a very rational reading of our statute, qualifies as a commodity under the definition for a commodity in the Commodity Exchange Act. So that gives us the authority to bring an enforcement matter for any type of manipulative activity, so long as a commodity is moving in interstate commerce. And as you can imagine, that ends up giving us a pretty broad reach. I was talking to one of my colleagues on the train ride up, and basically, and I'm not sure whether the chairman would agree with this or not, you might, there's been a lot of interesting dialogue between the SEC and the CFTC over the years, but under our statute, unless you're an onion or a movie box office receipt,
yep.
There's a chance you might be considered a commodity under our statute. So, and again, I don't intend to make it sound as, I don't intend to have a chilling effect or anything. It's just the reality of how the statute reads and how it's been interpreted by courts over the years.
So,
sorry.
Yeah.
So we don't have a special focus at the CFTC right now on Bitcoin. We're looking at all asset classes all the time, and we respond to tips and any kind of indication of wrongdoing in any particular marketplace, whether it's oil, whether it's metals, whether it's interest rates, whether it's indices for FX, as we saw last week. So there's nothing special about Bitcoin in that regard. If we hear of things and information is brought to us that indicates there's manipulation going on, we would respond to that. But at the moment, I don't have the impression that the staff, and certainly not at the commission level, at the moment, Bitcoin's not being singled out in any particular way.
Great. So, Ms. Calvery said that the regulations you have today and the statutes that you're applying, will get you as far as we've gotten, and maybe a little bit further. But at some point, the technology maybe doesn't fit the boxes that the statutes have in mind. And everybody needs to get on the same page to move that ball forward. So, Mr. Levitt, how is it that the industry can do that, can work with the regulators to find that common ground and get there?
I think that there's not going to be a tug and war between the SEC and the CFTC for jurisdiction over Bitcoin. It's not of sufficient importance at this point in time to warrant that kind of traditional tug of war, but there are people at both agencies that are studying the issue, and I would encourage the industry to reach out proactively to both the CFTC and the SEC and tell them what they're doing. Now, there are a variety of companies and goals. There are companies that interface with the public and companies which we've heard from this morning that interface with commercial counterparties. There are companies that are wallet companies. And I think that both the CFTC and the SEC would welcome meetings and definitions of exactly how those companies make up the fabric of a new financial system. My conversations, the few conversations I've had with regulators on a national level, reveals a real willingness, a desire to learn and to understand. On the state level, I sense a greater political attention to the issues than on the national level. Now, I'm not suggesting that the industry neglect the state level. I think they can't afford to. Whenever you have a product that interfaces the public in any form, you've got regulators falling all over themselves for jurisdiction. And rather than getting involved in terms of trying to pick the best regulator that you think represents your industry, I would see to it that you educate any regulator, whether he be or she be on a state or national level, in terms of how your company or how your end of the business may be unique and why it is a plus for the financial system, how it provides oil for the system rather than sand. And I think the arguments we've heard this morning are very compelling about the utility of the industry. But I think they go pretty far beyond the level of understanding of all but a few regulators on both the CFTC, SEC, and certainly the state level.
Mr. Newsome?
Jerry, I think if you look at the CFTC, they're in a very unique position with regard to the regulation of virtual currencies, because I think a determination of who regulates the underlying Bitcoin or whatever virtual currency it is, and then regulating derivatives on that are two very separate things. So there really has to be no determination made about what Bitcoin is and who is the underlying regulator for the CFTC to regulate derivatives based upon Bitcoin or other virtual currency. And you see that process taking place right now with LedgerX, who has an application into the CFTC to trade physically delivered options on Bitcoin. So a determination of who regulates underlying Bitcoin is immaterial to LedgerX's application to become a derivatives exchange to trade derivatives on Bitcoin.
So, up here we have former and present federal regulators, but of course so much is happening at the state level, as Mr. Levitt pointed out. So, as we know, the New York bit license proposal, this is for Ms. Calvery, contains anti-money laundering provisions that go beyond what FinCEN requires for money transmitters. What are your thoughts on these requirements?
Well, first of all, the bit license is seeking to do something much broader than what FinCEN regulates. The state of New York is a prudential regulator. It regulates for consumer fraud. It regulates for money laundering and terrorist finance. And so the bit license seeks to do a lot of different things. In terms of where it is right now on the anti-money laundering provisions, I'm heartened by the fact that we have a state like New York and other states who are considering licensing and trying to think through some of these issues. It seems as though the process is one that's been open and iterative to the public in terms of seeking comment and seeking different rounds of comment. So we'll all see where it ends up in the future. But from FinCEN's perspective, our relationship and partnership with the states is incredibly important. We're a very small agency, And we build off of the backbone of other federal regulators as well as state regulators, and we work in partnership. So from our perspective, having sensible but strong regulation at the state level that's going to do the job to fight money laundering and terrorist finance is very important.
You know, I think any of us who've been in the business world have suffered from the pain of over-regulation or irrational regulation, and that colors the thinking of a lot of people who are younger and newer at this business. They tend to say no regulation. This is cryptocurrency and it really deserves no regulation. I think you do a disservice to the growth of the industry by being blind to the realities of the world we live in. And in today's world, having a compliance officer is a mark of professionalism. And I think the cryptocurrency industry views a compliance officer as a cousin of the devil himself. And I think that's wrong, because we're in a steep learning curve, and there's no better way to adjust irrational, misunderstanding regulation than by having the kind of transparency that, I don't care whether you call him a chief compliance officer or a banana, but the function is to bring transparency, and I think that's an important function.
So here's a question from the audience that I think is sort of challenging what you're saying, Mr. Levitt. This is from Jim Harper from the Bitcoin Foundation. He says, advertising has had a relatively stable, read poor, reputation over periods of both intensive and relatively lax Federal Trade Commission regulation. Is there evidence from other fields that regulation improves reputation?
I couldn't hear the last part of that.
Is there evidence from other fields that regulation improves reputation?
I don't know how you can codify that except in terms of your own experience. And having gone through the dialogue of hiring literally thousands of people, of structuring hundreds of boards, of serving on 24 public boards of 24 publicly owned companies, I think my experience would tell me that the question asked so many times before these relationships are formalized is, how good is your company? What are the qualifications for their leadership? Do you conform to regulatory standards? What's the level of transparency? It is a terribly important factor in terms of image and reputation. And is it the only factor? Certainly no, but I think it's a dreadful mistake to base your business plan on opposing regulation. I don't see that on a risk-reward basis that makes much sense at all. Now, you may not have the same kind of layers of reputation and teams of lawyers that Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan might have, but you'd have the same kind of regulation that any publicly owned or even privately owned company that someday may seek to tap public or private funds, it's a plus, it's not a negative. And I think everything you do in the early stages of building a business is to try to diminish the negatives and amplify the pluses. I think that having disclosure, transparency, which is really the goal of sound regulation, should be, I think that's a net plus.
Mr. Newsome, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I would answer that in three ways. Hunt Brothers and silver, Enron and natural gas, and OPEC and crude oil prices. I think that goes to the heart of regulation. helping the overall industry.
I would just add, too, the chairman mentioned this, but I think regulation connotes that a certain level of standards are being met. And I would be shocked if the data didn't show that a majority of Americans use regulation in some respect anyway as a proxy for minimum standards. And without that, I would guess, I'm sure the data would prove this out, that most Americans wouldn't have the confidence to either use that service or buy that good without it. That just has to be a fact of life.
So here's
I say that again without seeing specific data,
Sure.
but I'd be shocked if that's not the case. That doesn't mean that there are failures in the regulatory front. Occasionally, that happens, and standards aren't always met, even among regulated entities. But I think it's a pretty safe assumption to make.
So here's another question from the audience, and we'll go down the line. Andrew Paprocki from Bloomberg asks, have any of you purchased a good or service using Bitcoin? Well, we start with you, Mr. Wetjen, Commissioner Wetjen.
Any of you purchased?
Any good or service using Bitcoin?
Look, I'm such a lowly civil servant. I can't afford a smartphone to be able to use it easily.
We'll talk after. And
Okay.
Mr. Levitt?
I've tried.
Mr. Newsome?
No. We actually tried to get one of the companies we advised to pay us in Bitcoin, but they couldn't do so.
Ms. Calvery?
I have not personally, but we certainly do some purchases at FinCEN.
Okay. Well, Coin Center invites you all to a workshop where we will get you each a wallet, and we'll do something fun. So it's not a secret that legitimate Bitcoin companies are having trouble establishing bank accounts. What can we do to get banks more comfortable? So, Ms. Calvery, why don't we start with you?
I think that goes to the 2 questions ago about the whole idea of your reputation, and if you're regulated, do you have a better reputation, and what evidence is there that if you're regulated, you have a better reputation? One of the things that I've been hearing from banks as we've been working through this issue quite diligently with them is their concerns about the industry and whether it's regulated enough and how they can control for their own risks when they're not sure that, 1, they understand the technology, as Chairman Levitt suggested, and 2, that they understand that there's controls in place amongst Bitcoin companies, exchangers. They don't want to assume a risk that they don't understand and that they're not sure is being well controlled.
But how? But can we be more specific? Are there particular things that companies can do to? I mean, how is that risk being judged on the part of the companies? Because ultimately, the banks are going to be looking to their regulators, and what are the regulators? What are the answers you're giving them when they're asking you these questions about how they manage that risk or how they judge that risk?
So there's no specific, do A, B, C, and D, and you're good type of answer, because every business, so a bank, when they decide who they're going to take on as a customer, has to look at their own risk appetite, their own controls that they have, and whether they think that they can control for the risk, given their resources, given their technology, given their understanding of the client, and make a decision based on those factors. So, but what we tell them is that you do need to apply a risk-based approach and focus on the threat of actual illicit finance, not on the threat that of regulatory risk, not on the threat that you're just concerned about an entire industry but haven't actually looked at it or assessed the potential for illicit finance. And if a bank or other financial institution takes that risk-based approach, then they're doing what we expect them to do and what the international standards expect them to do.
I've noticed FinCEN and other parts of Treasury issue new guidance or statements encouraging banks not to be so severe with their de-risking as it pertains to money service businesses of different kinds. Is that something that we might see more of in the future?
Well, we just issued one last Friday, so
Yeah.
it's kind of soon to do a second statement. But what we were hoping to accomplish there with this statement was to set the tone, both for our delegated examiners as well as industry, on what exactly the Bank Secrecy Act, our anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism laws require. And that is this risk-based approach, a focus on actual illicit finance and the risk of illicit finance, not the risk of regulatory risk and just broad pronouncements to close off certain types of businesses.
All of this is related. By that, I mean there are people at all the major banks studying this issue. There are people who are very strong proponents of the issue. There are others at the banks who feel that the Bitcoin industry is competitive, but I don't think that's the major factor. It's misunderstood. The volatility works against it. It was not dissimilar from the accounting firms. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, it was very difficult to get an accounting firm to do an audit of a major company. Today, it's much easier. I think that through the industry trade groups, through the leadership of the industry, calling on the banks, not necessarily the CEO, but the people who really are dealing with bitcoins and cryptocurrency and understand them, and repeating those visits, you're going to break through in a significant bank, and then the rest of them will follow. They're a very important part of the fabric of building this industry, and I think it should be a top priority for every firm to do what they can. The regional firms should devote their time to major regional banks. It's likely that a regional bank will come on board before the J.P. Morgans or the Citibanks do. And I would put major emphasis on those regional banks, particularly firms that are located in the Miamis, the Atlantas, the San Franciscos of the United States.
So,
Just
go ahead.
real quickly. There's given the time period we've been through in recent years, and I'm not sure we're all the way through it, but in response to the crisis and the legislative response, the regulatory response, the enforcement response, which is still ongoing, certainly it's led to, I think, a heightened sense of risk aversion as it relates to safekeeping or stewarding your reputation, or even more basically as it relates to compliance and legal risks. So there would have to be a really attractive cost-benefit analysis, I would think, if you're within the management of one of these banks before you decided to embrace the technology in a way where you're feeling comfortable enough to partner with some type of Bitcoin company. I get the sense of that based on my interactions with the sector quite a bit. There's a real movement towards simplifying and reducing compliance and legal risk, and to sort of with open eyes embrace something that's not tested, not fully understood.
And that makes it difficult for the testing to ever happen.
I'd mobilize your VCs as well. I mean, the VCs are a very large source of business, particularly for regional banks, and they should be standing side by side with companies and calling on the banks and breaking through. And once you get some of the regionals, the others will follow.
So I want to talk a little bit about what the CFTC is doing and the need for these derivative products. So, Mr. Newsome, you're on the board of LedgerX. So what is, and LedgerX is trying to build an options exchange. So what is the need for these products, and how are you going about seeking that approval?
Well, Jerry, LedgerX is quite far down the pipeline with regard to their application. One of the initial issues is an issue that Commissioner Wetjen brought up, and that's the Commission staff developing a comfort that the underlying Bitcoin market itself is not easily manipulated. And I think the Commission staff is beyond that question now, and they're looking specifically at the contracts, which will be pretty plain vanilla options contracts. And I think they'll be used in two ways, because they will be physically delivered contracts. One, because they're physically delivered, the buyers and sellers of those contracts will be able to buy and sell Bitcoin through the contract. And then secondly, for the commercial users that have exposure to price volatility in Bitcoin, you'll be able to use those contracts then to hedge that price exposure. And I think those are the two primary components of how those contracts will be utilized.
Commissioner Wetjen, are you seeing more applications, more folks coming to the Commission looking for approval?
Well, it comes to us as commissioners in a couple of different ways. The first and most obvious way is when the staff recommends to the Commission some kind of Commission action of approval, I guess in this case. And it could be approval of an exchange or platform focusing on Bitcoin derivatives, or it could be approving a contract. And we've really had only one opportunity to do that so far. I am aware, as Jim just alluded to, that there are conversations taking place at a staff level between industry participants and the CFTC staff. But that's usually how the process works. The people that need regulatory approval start with the staff and work that way, and then eventually it comes to a head with the commissioners. So I'm not especially aware of anything other than Ledger X, to be honest. I'm generally aware there's a lot of churn, a lot of discussions taking place, but I don't know much by way of specifics.
So Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, has been signaling that the UK wants to be the center of virtual currency trade by creating an especially welcoming regulatory atmosphere. And Japan has similarly suggested that it wants to pursue a light touch approach. How should the global regulatory reaction to Bitcoin affect what the U.S. does? And to what extent is global cooperation necessary and possible? So we'll start with Ms. Calvery.
So global cooperation on anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism is essential. We all know money moves globally, and both criminals and terrorist financiers are seeking to move money globally through the least transparent means possible. So there is an international standard-setting body, the Financial Action Task Force, that sets forth what different countries should have in terms of the basic regulatory regime with respect to money laundering and terrorist finance. And virtual currency has been a topic as of late, and something that everyone is looking at and thinking about the standards. So when I hear the UK or Japan say that they want to have a welcoming business atmosphere for cryptocurrencies, that to me does not necessarily signify that they're not also going to have appropriate anti-money laundering controls in place. And I think the same is true here in the United States. I think the challenge is to figure out a way to have both, and that we can certainly do so, and that will only improve the reputation of the industry and allow it to grow and prosper.
Commissioner Wetjen, how much do you pay attention to what's happening internationally?
Well, I do pay attention to it. In fact, I was traveling overseas last week, and the topic of Bitcoin came up in every meeting I had with someone from the official sector. So that includes regulators overseas in Western Europe in this case. So it's clearly something on their minds. It hasn't risen to the level where, as I understand it anyway at the moment, it hasn't risen to a level where it's becoming an active discussion within some of the international coordinating bodies that the CFTC is involved in. IOSCO would be probably the best example of a group that the CFTC works with that has a coordinating role and sets standards and principles for the regulatory community around the globe to try and follow. So it hasn't really been an active topic of discussion in that body. I think it's probably being discussed at the country level by those who are a member of it, but at the moment it might be a little premature to call for any kind of particular coordination. But I would just end by saying, though, that the derivatives markets historically have always been very, very global in nature, and these bodies are pretty relevant to the work of the CFTC, and in some cases or with some issues, perhaps more so than others, but we're going through this very important debate right now concerning standards for clearinghouses. And at the heart of that is whether or not principles established by IOSCO in this case are being abided by with respect to each individual jurisdiction around the globe. So once it comes to that level and becomes part of, Bitcoin becomes part of a discussion at that level, it will be very, very relevant.
So we've got just a few minutes left. Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? If anybody has a question, raise your hand.
Jerry, while we're waiting for a question, too, let me just add that in terms of the business climate here in the U.S., we have now seen nearly 100 virtual currency businesses register with FinCEN, and we're receiving several suspicious activity reports and reporting on a regular basis. It's quite well done. The reporting that has come in, law enforcement finds it quite useful. So I think we do have a growing industry here in the U.S.
You mentioned before how the Bitcoin blockchain is open and that can be useful to law enforcement. And FinCEN, if I understand correctly, also develops intelligence. To what extent have you been looking at the blockchain, developing tools to analyze and make your work more useful?
Well, without going into any specifics of exactly what we do at FinCEN, I do care. So one of the previous panelists said, is there anyone here who thinks about national security every single day? And I didn't raise my hand, but I probably should have. So we care about how ISIL is financing itself, the Islamic State, if you'd rather go with the press term. We care about recovering assets stolen by the former Ukrainian regime. We care about how the Mexican drug cartels are moving money through the United States and back into Mexico. We are following different patterns and flows of money every single day, including things involving virtual currencies, cryptocurrencies, digital currencies, Bitcoin, and the whole like. And so we do follow the technology. We do work with and train our law enforcement counterparts on how they might be able to follow money by looking at the ledger. And then we watch with concern, and as we see new technologies develop to make it more difficult to trace the flow of proceeds.
I would just add that trying to understand Bitcoin more and more has had one interesting result for me within the CFTC and just looking at the current rules that we have in place. I'm going to have a meeting later this week where I'm bringing in all the division directors, and the topic of the conversation is going to be, what are all the rules that we have in place under CFTC regs that apply to intermediaries, exchanges, clearinghouses, or even swap dealers, I suppose, where there's some kind of an obligation that entails the processing of a payment. Mm-hmm. Our industry is one where collateral is being moved around all the time between customers and FCMs, which are clearing members, basically members of clearinghouses, and then between clearing members and clearing houses. So money and collateral is moving, money and securities and like, they're moving all the time throughout the course of a day in our industry, and we have rules that govern that process. So one very specific thing came up. This is an issue Jim knows a great deal about. We have a requirement of clearing members and how quickly they've got to put their own money into the account of a customer if the customer account is short. And there's specific timelines that have to be met under our rules. And we ran into some problems where there were questions around feasibility about how fast you could send money in, how fast a customer could send money into a clearing member. I'm not suggesting that Bitcoin is a solution for that tomorrow, but the point is that having this greater understanding about innovation generally in the payment processing space and how that encourages policymakers to think about, even if it's not a particular technology, but how can there be improvements more generally from any kind of innovation as it relates to transferring securities and money in our regulated environment is a very, very healthy thing, I think, to be discussing. And again, just my entree into the Bitcoin world through these contracts being filed has led to that. Now, maybe there's other work going on inside the CFTC as well that I'm not aware of, but I, for one, thought it'd be useful just to see again how we could maybe look again at our rule set and figure out how innovations in this space could reduce risk, but also perhaps make compliance more efficient.
So I think we have time for one question if anybody wants to volunteer. Yes, right here.
Statement. Oh, thank you, sir.
Well, let's make sure it's a question, though.
Okay.
Sure.
How
And
then,
we'll keep it short because we got
given the
1.5
multiplicity
minutes.
of currencies in the world, there are over 550 different digital currencies, right? So they all have sometimes technological functions, like Bitcoin as a rail, yet they're born in a decentralized atmosphere. The first time in the nature of humanity is there this currency that is completely decentralized.
What's
by
the
nature.
question? Let's get to we have 1 minute.
Fine. How do you make the differentiation, and what do you intend to do about a crowd of developers that is going to push back on every front, whereas Bitcoin may die, another may pop up? How do you look at that from a decentralized standpoint? Because it's like herding cats.
Bitcoin's decentralized. How do you regulate it? Seriously.
I think from a derivative standpoint, it doesn't matter because Mark
I think that's right.
already made the comment that most of the contracts that are traded as futures or options are global to begin with. So I don't think that creates any real problems from a derivative standpoint. It may create more issues for regulators who are regulating the underlying Bitcoin itself. From a derivative standpoint, I think that's actually pretty normal.
So final questions as we're out of time. In 1 or 2 words, the question from the beginning of the panel, which was, where do you see Bitcoin vis-a-vis regulation in 5 years? Let's go just down the line, Mr. Regent.
Evolved compared to where it is now anyway.
Okay.
Hard to predict otherwise.
Mr. Levitt?
I think we'll be absolutely a very important part of the financial markets, and there'll be a panel up here at that point talking about some other what is today arcane product, but by then I think Bitcoins will be very much part of our financial system, accepted and regulated.
I think we're at a very critical stage right now, and I think education is a big component of that. I think from a market standpoint, obviously the technology has surrounded Bitcoin and other currencies to make it successful. It already is. I think from a derivatives trading standpoint, we're far down the road to creating LedgerX or other exchanges that will trade derivatives off of virtual currency. But I think today, there are probably other groups, but I know there's one, the Chamber for Virtual Currency in D.C., whose sole purpose is trying to educate policymakers, regulators about virtual currency and how it can be utilized and how it can serve the marketplace. And I think those kind of roles are certainly critically important as we sit here today.
Ms. Calvery?
Accepted and regulated. I concur with Chairman Levitt.
Great. Well, help me thank the panel for being here.